I have a confession. Haze here is one of the objectively worst and critically poor received games to ever be released on 7th generation consoles. However, it's actually a guilty pleasure of mine. No joke. To be fair, I'm not ignorant of the mass criticisms and fair objective issues that this game boasts. However, I do put this game in a similar camp to experiences like Vampire Reign and even Sony's own released exclusive Lair, as being a game that had potential, great creative direction, but in the end, the execution here just left a lot to be desired. I'm going to break down the core of all of these issues with the game in this video, as well as talk about why, despite all these issues, I can still find the fun in the game. And I'm going to do this without making excuses for the state of the game or trying to convince any one of you that the game is actually secretly brilliant. It's not. It's a heavily flawed, poor effort of a shooter that simply contains flashes of absolute brilliance. Yet when it comes down to the objective portions, that being the quality of the game, the responsiveness of the controls, art direction, sound design, and so on, there is no escaping that Haze here is infected with some of this industry's weirdest and poorest decisions. So let's get down to business and talk about why Haze is not the worst game for me on PS3, but still, at the end of the day, the second worst perhaps? Firstly, for anyone who hasn't played this game, Haze was released as an exclusive for PlayStation 3 in early 2008. The game was plastered everywhere at the time, being heavily advertised before launch at major events such as E3, here on YouTube as well back in the day, and seemingly, we were all gearing up for launch. It was no surprise why there was a good deal of hype surrounding this entry. This game was developed by Free Radical, who previously created one of the most notorious shooters for the 6th generation, Time Splitters. So coming off the great foundation and success of that franchise, it's just no wonder why people were looking forward to their first true next-gen outing, as well as the start of a potential new franchise. Sony bought the exclusive rights to this game, which was published by Ubisoft, and the game was being marketed at the time as the Halo Killer, being Sony's answer to the acclaimed Microsoft franchise and system seller IP. It is perhaps because of this why this release was such an embarrassment for Sony as well as the PS3, and it seemed to just be another inconsistent promised failure for a platform that was already having a hard time competing with the competition. While Haze is a shooter at its heart, it boasts a unique twist on the basic FPS gameplay, as it puts you in the boots of a private military soldier whose entire company is under the influence of a toxic drug known as Nectar. Nectar gives these soldiers enhanced speed, greater field of vision, additional strength, and an accelerated adrenaline rush that makes these soldiers supposedly hard to kill and incredibly resilient whilst on the battlefield. What all of this means to you as a player is that you have the ability to administer this drug into your bloodstream, and it helps out a bit when you're in combat, as you can more easily see enemies hiding behind corners. You can move quite quicker as a result of this as well. And it's here we have our first major issue. The gameplay of Haze is actually quite good, if I'm being honest. I mean, I played shooters that feel way worse than this game controls, and it's only running at 30 FPS, but I must say, the frame rate is actually consistent enough that I didn't have much of an issue, and the responsiveness of the controls is quite good too. The overall gunplay of Haze is actually quite fun, and it's more dynamic, where instead of peeking around cover and trying to shoot enemies one by one, like in Call of Duty for example, you're constantly in movement and only taking brief cover behind walls to regain your health and administer Nectar before you move out again, trying to dispatch anyone in your way. The problem here is the creative direction of the Nectar drug itself. First off, while it's really cool to have, they just don't take it far enough. The Nectar mechanic would have been so much more appealing if you could overdose. Perhaps if you used it often in battle, your body would become sort of reliant on it, where you'd start to lose health more quickly and become slower without it. Like, this is what I mean here about flashes of brilliance, because you see the potential for a system like this that takes the drug mechanics and creates great, unique gameplay moments. But because things like this only seem to happen during story segments, you only get the idea of what a bigger picture concept could look like here. To make matters worse, a little less than halfway through the game, it's just taken away from you. The whole Nectar drug, the suit, all the enhancements that go along with it, and what you have here is a whole set of new but vastly less interesting gameplay concepts to play with. Like, you could play dead in this game, you could create traps using the Nectar purloined from fallen troops. but the enhancements and speed, the strength that the drug brought you is just gone. You get quite literally 2 hours using Nectar, and then for the remaining 2 to 3 hours of the game, you get to play in a more guerrilla style warfare against the people using this drug. Just why? Like, you could imagine if your character has been on this drug for, let's just say, weeks at a time, or however long it was in your body, that he would become reliant on the drug itself. So what if instead of pillaging Nectar off enemies to create traps, you had to pillage it for your own personal use and keep your stock, in your arsenal at all times? Otherwise, you would just lose health and die. This is, again, what I mean by flashes of brilliance. This is a gameplay concept that just lets your imagination run rampant, yet it's barely iterated on here, and when it is done, it isn't taken far enough to allow for just real interesting gameplay moments. It's a shame, but again, like almost everything in this game, you could just imagine the potential. And of course, I have to take a look at the Haze box art for PlayStation 3. Yeah, there's a couple of funny badges there on the bottom. This was the era where Sony finally got the patent rights for the DualShock branding, and so you can see it's DualShock 3 compatible there on the bottom. That was a bit interesting there during that PS3 launch title, using the 6-axis over that kind of legal battle that they were going on. Anyway, it's an okay cover there. Kind of shows the Mantell Trooper, and then we got our logo here on the side. Pretty bare bones. On the back, it says "Fight the Addiction," which you barely do. It's not really that much of an addiction, if I'm being honest. But we got a couple of screenshots. It talks about the drug itself and the multiplayer elements and things like that. Cool look at the game disc here. I do like the yellow branding, the yellow on black. I think it was an interesting color scheme at the time. I kind of wish that they, took it a little bit further when it came to the art direction, but I'll get onto that in just a bit. And here with the manual, it's pretty basic. There is a decent number of pages here, but it is in full black and white. I thought this was a little bit of a missed opportunity to create this sort of black on yellow color scheme. That would have been nice. But, there's some information here, some light information about the game and just the different modes and the characters and stuff. So, it's definitely better than most of the, manuals that we would get for around this era. At least at this time, it was a bit more consistent where you could get some decent manuals, but they were phasing that out absolutely. And on the back here, an ad for Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Vegas 2, which I'll be reviewing on the channel in some time in the future. So yeah, brief look there at the Haze box art. It's pretty bare bones, but I do like the cover art for this one. Visually, many considered Haze to look outdated when it came out. Honestly, for me, I remember at the time, I thought this game was quite attractive, but on my third playthrough here, more than 10 years after the second, I might add, in retrospect, what we have here is just an issue of art direction and inconsistent detail throughout. Haze boasts a few different environments. You'll mostly be fighting in industrial compounds as well as a few shanty towns, but the game has like one color palette for the vast majority of its runtime, and it just doesn't seem to do much with the environments that it presents. The opening section is quite nice though. You find yourself shooting in the jungle, and you combine the vegetation, making it harder to spot enemies, which in turn makes the prospect of the Nectar more attractive, with the green lush vibrancy that level represents, and it's quite nice. Some later sections involve going into enemy compounds, and then towards the end you'll find yourself fighting in abandoned resorts, craft carriers, but it's the density here on offer which is just very, very low. You can quite literally see the rooms comprised of hallways connecting them to larger rooms, and there's only a few levels here that have density where you get the impression it's actually a lived-in space, but it's quite fleeting, and the color palette, again, is just near non-existent. Most of the game can just look muddy and desaturated, and had they had gone with just a more colorful world, or perhaps did something, yet again with the Nectar, where it influenced the environment, and for the record, there's actually evidence where it clearly does this anyway, but maybe it just brings out, an amount of color or pop to the environments that just wasn't there. It just would have been awesome. Many of these ideas are teased in the game, but never actually amount to anything meaningful. And what we have here is a game that I wouldn't say is necessarily ugly in terms of detail. I think it's quite appropriate for the era. It just lacks in density and ambience. And so it's basically sterile in comparison to other shooters like this. As for sound design, here it's a hit or miss. The soundtrack is very forgettable in this game. There's basically no theme. And what we have here is perhaps the most boring and non-present soundtracks I've listened to in games from this era. During most shootouts, there's nothing in the way of music. You just hear bullets and the screaming from people getting killed, and it just gets dull. And when the music does come alive, it barely makes any effort to make itself known. Now, gun sounds and environmental noise is pretty decent overall. The guns don't have too much in the way of reverb or different noises, but what I like here is sort of the onboard AI that's only present in the first half of the game. You're wearing a suit, and as you administer Nectar, a voice plays out to let your body know that it is being injected and regulating. And it just would have been cool to, again, take this further and perhaps make something to, where it sounds more akin to like a flight system or something like the nanosuit in Crisis, but it's only halfway there. I think the sound fares better than the visuals overall, but that being said, it leaves a lot more to be desired than what you get here. And you're left again only imagining what more and how much more could have been done here. The last and final thing I want to touch upon is the story. The concept of what is here isn't terrible, it's the writing. It's very much possible, and I think this is why the game is heralded as many people's worst PS3 game, and for some even the worst game of that generation. That what is here is just some of the most offensive writing I've heard in a long time. To say that this game has simply poor writing would be like saying the Fast and Furious franchise is a giant advertisement for men's testosterone. This is perhaps the worst writing in a game from the 7th generation. The characters here are so unlikable, so nonsensical, that you start to question how anyone involved in the storytelling here was able to get a job in this industry. Now, I actually think the voice acting is quite decent. It's one of those situations where I think you could feel the voice actors did just the very best with what they were given, and even the greatest actors here, can't mask some poor written lines, but immediately once you start, playing this game, you just get the sense that it was made by mid-2000s college bros. And the dialogue teeters on the edge of just being absolutely hilarious to just downright erraticism. It's almost a sight to behold in of itself, and once you get to the ending, you just get this sense that they were all sitting in a room, like writing the last line, thinking to themselves, man, ain't this impressive? Now, I must say, the story itself, again, and I sound like I'm repeating myself a dozen times in this video already, but it has flashes of brilliance. You start to notice something very off when you're playing this game, and I'm not trying to act arrogant here, I'm literally talking about the story itself. Like, you just don't have the full picture, like something is being shielded from your eyes. And what perhaps unfolds here is one of the most brilliant, and again, I'm not kidding, the most brilliant display of censorship I've seen in the confines of a story. Once you start thinking about it and how the drug influenced your entire gameplay experience, at least in that first few hours, you're like, oh my god, that's incredible. I have never seen a game take it this far before. And this is what I mean regarding why I can't say this is the worst PS3 game or give it a score like a 1 out of 5, because there are a few things in here. It's only a few, but nevertheless, there are a few things in here that are just so expertly done. It blows your mind. And if you give yourself a chance to really think about what you just played, and like a broken record, they just don't take it far enough. It's such a shame. The bottom line is, I just can't help but like Haze for this reason, because I've seen a few things in here that I still haven't seen in games today. Someone made an excellent point that I read somewhere, probably on Twitter. They said, why are we bothering to remake games that already critically are well received? Games that are heralded as the best games of all time, when in fact we should be remaking games that were compromised in their original vision and never got to release exactly per the creative's intent. Haze to me is a game that, if remade and if given the creative genius to master all of these interesting moments, these flashes of brilliance, if you will, could at least go down as one of the most interesting shooters of our time. But we'll likely never get that. This game has been buried so many times, and it's only notorious because of how poorly it was received. And I didn't even touch upon this yet, but it wasn't just the creative direction of this game either that was the problem. The quality of the game itself was just poor. You had game-breaking bugs. One bug had the ground textures in a whole level just not load, and you actually had to restart your whole console in order to fix it. They also had multiplayer in here too. In fact, this whole game's campaign could be played cooperatively with someone else, I think up to 4 people. So they brought so many elements in here, but yeah, it's just an amalgamation of so many interesting ideas with perhaps the poorest of executions we've seen from this era. It makes me sad because what is here is legitimately good and interesting. If it only perhaps had more time, a better creative direction, maybe a smaller scope, I don't know. What could have been would have been so compelling. In any case, let me know what you guys think. I almost feel alone in my analysis here of the game. Every single time I see a video on it, someone is always talking about the negatives. And fair enough, this game is layered with so many of them, it's hard to ignore them at times. But when I let my imagination just wrap around the concept of what is actually here, I just can't help but become excited. I hope you guys have a good one. I'm looking forward to hearing from you in the comments. I actually made a video on this game, I think the demo for this game way back in the day on YouTube. So yeah, it was interesting playing this one around launch, and like I said, it was my 3rd playthrough here. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of this. I'm actually curious to see what you guys have to say about Haze here, and I'll talk with you later. Thank you very much.